What if one of the smallest countries in the world sat quietly upon the bones of an ancient burial ground, and beneath its marble floors and painted ceilings lay a hill that once stood outside the walls of Rome, a place of tombs and gardens where the living rarely lingered after dark? What if the very ground where crowds now gather beneath a great dome was once a marshy, unremarkable slope, chosen not for its beauty but for a memory? A single grave that people came to visit in secret, and then in the open, and then with an emperor's blessing. Tonight, we are going to walk slowly through the hidden history of that hill and the small state that rose above it, the place we now call Vatican City, from the days when it was only a low rise across the river from ancient Rome, through the centuries of tombs and shrines and quiet pilgrims, through the building and rebuilding of the great church that stands there now, and into the strange layered world that lies beneath its floors, where old streets and forgotten graves still rest in the dark. This is a story of stone and memory, more than a story of armies. It moves through the rise and fall of empires, but it lingers most on the smaller things: the lamps left burning in underground chapels, the workmen who carried marble up muddy paths, the pilgrims who traveled for months to kneel for a single hour, and the long, patient centuries in which a burial ground became the center of a faith followed by many millions. So let the room grow quiet around you. Let your shoulders soften and your thoughts slow down. There is no need to hold on to anything tonight. This is a calm journey through a very old place, and it will move gently, giving you time to drift wherever you need to go. If you find comfort in these quiet walks through history, in the slow unfolding of forgotten cities and half-remembered lives, you are welcome to subscribe to Lost Chapters and return whenever the night feels long. There is always another old map to open, another dim room of the past to step into together. And now, with that said, we can let the modern world fall away and travel back to a time long before there was any city upon this hill, when it was only a slope of clay and reeds beside a slow brown river. To understand the Vatican, we have to begin with the river, because everything here begins with the Tiber. The Tiber is not a grand river in the way that great rivers of legend are grand. It is muddy and winding, prone to flooding, carrying silt down from the hills of central Italy toward the sea. But it was enough. Along its banks, over many centuries before anyone spoke of emperors or popes, small settlements grew on the 7 hills that would one day form the heart of Rome. Those hills, the Palatine, the Capitoline, the Aventine, and the others, rose on the eastern side of the river. And it was there that the city of Rome took shape, first as a cluster of villages, then as a town, then as something far larger than anyone in those early days could have imagined. The hill we care about tonight was not one of those 7. It stood on the far side of the water, on the western bank, low and damp and set apart. The Romans called this whole district beyond the river by names that suggested it was somehow outside the true city, a place across the water, a place of gardens and clay pits, and the graves of the dead. The word Vatican itself comes down to us from this ancient landscape, from a name the Romans used for the hill or the marshy ground around it. The exact origin is uncertain, and scholars have debated it for a long time. Some connected it to an old word for prophecy, imagining that seers once made their pronouncements there. Others linked it simply to the local terrain. What seems most likely is that it was an old regional name, worn smooth by centuries of use, the kind of name a place keeps long after anyone remembers what it first meant. In those early Roman centuries, the Vatican district had no glory to it at all. The soil was poor. The clay was good for making bricks and pottery, and so there were kilns and workshops scattered across the slope, and the smell of wet earth and smoke would have hung over it on working days. The Tiber flooded this low ground often, leaving behind mud and standing water, and the Romans generally considered the western bank less desirable than the crowded, dry, prestigious hills across the river. It was a place you passed through, or worked in, or buried your dead in, rather than a place you lived if you had a choice. And burial is where the story truly begins to gather weight. Roman law forbade burying the dead within the sacred boundary of the city itself. so the dead were laid to rest outside the walls, along the roads that led away from Rome in every direction. These roadside cemeteries stretched for miles, lined with tombs of every size, from simple markers to grand mausoleums, built by wealthy families who wanted to be remembered. The Vatican slope, lying across the river and outside the old core of the city, became one of these places of the dead. Along the roads that crossed it and across its lower ground, there grew a scattered city of tombs, quiet in the daytime, silent at night, visited by families who came to remember those they had lost and to share meals at the graveside, as Roman custom encouraged them to do. So already, long before any church rose here, this hill carried a particular character. It was a threshold place, a border between the living city and the country beyond, a place where Romans came to think about death and memory. If you had stood there on an ordinary afternoon 2,000 years ago, you would have seen the river sliding past, the great mass of Rome rising on the far bank with its temples and rooftops catching the light, and around you the quiet rows of tombs, the working kilns, the gardens of the wealthy who had built pleasure grounds on the slopes, and perhaps a few travelers moving along the road. It was a place of edges, of comings and goings, of endings. Into this landscape, in the middle of the 1st century of our era, the emperors brought something new. The imperial family owned gardens on the Vatican side of the river, and it was here, in a great open space, that a circus was built, a long arena for chariot racing, first associated with the Emperor Caligula, and later completed and used under the Emperor Nero. This was a place of spectacle, of thundering horses and roaring crowds, of dust rising into the sky on race days. At the center of the arena stood a tall Egyptian obelisk, a single shaft of red granite, brought all the way from Egypt, carried across the sea and up the river at enormous cost, set upright to mark the spine of the racing track. That obelisk had already been ancient when the Romans took it. It had stood in Egypt for centuries before it ever saw the Tiber. Hold that obelisk in your mind for a moment, because it is one of the quiet threads that will run through this entire story. It is the only object we will meet tonight that has stood, more or less continuously, watching over this same ground from the days of Nero to the present. Everything else will rise and fall around it. Cities will change, empires will collapse, the faith of the people will transform utterly, and still that single stone will remain, moved only once across the centuries, always upright, always facing the sky. Remember it, we will return to it near the end. Now, the reign of Nero is remembered for many things, and much of what later writers said about him was shaped by their hostility to his memory. But among the events tied to his name is a great fire that swept through Rome, and in the aftermath, according to the Roman historian Tacitus writing decades later, blame fell upon a small and little understood community in the city, the followers of a new faith that had come out of the eastern provinces, out of Judea. These were the early Christians, at that time a tiny and often suspected group, following the teachings of a Galilean teacher who had been executed under Roman authority a generation earlier. Tacitus tells us that these people were punished with great cruelty, and that some of these punishments took place in the imperial gardens and the circus on the Vatican side of the river. I will not dwell on the harshness of what the sources describe, because our journey tonight is a gentle one, and because the deeper meaning lies not in the suffering itself, but in what grew from the memory of it. For among the early Christian community in Rome, a tradition took hold, one that would shape this hill for the next 2,000 years. It was believed that one of the most important early leaders of the faith, the apostle known as Peter, a fisherman from Galilee who had become a central figure among the followers of Jesus, had come to Rome, had led the community there, and had died there during this time of persecution. And it was believed that he was buried on the Vatican slope, among the ordinary tombs of that roadside cemetery, in a simple grave in the ground. Here we must be careful and honest, as any calm and thoughtful telling of this story should be. The historical evidence for the earliest events is thin, as it is for so much of the 1st century. Written sources from that exact moment are few, and much of what we have comes from tradition preserved and written down by later generations. Historians continue to discuss what can be known with certainty and what must remain a matter of belief and memory. But whatever the modern historian concludes about the details, one thing is clear and important. The early Christians of Rome believed from a very early date that Peter was buried on this hill. They came to the spot. They remembered it. They passed the memory down, and that memory, more than any decree or any army, is the true foundation upon which everything else here was built. For in the quiet decades and centuries that followed, while the Roman Empire went about its vast business of governing the Mediterranean world, a small stream of visitors kept coming to that unremarkable grave on the Vatican slope. They came carefully, sometimes cautiously, for their faith was not always tolerated and was at times actively persecuted. They left small marks, scratched prayers, signs of remembrance. Around the grave, over time, other Christians wished to be buried nearby, to rest close to the apostle they honored, and so a Christian presence grew within and alongside the older pagan cemetery. The two worlds lay side by side in the earth, the old Roman tombs with their images of feasting and gardens and the gods, and the newer Christian graves with their symbols of hope in a life beyond death. And so the story moves quietly forward through generations that left few names behind. Picture the hill across those long years. The circus fell gradually out of use and into disrepair. The gardens changed hands. The cemetery kept growing, spreading across the slope, its tombs stacked and crowded as space grew scarce. Some of them small houses of the dead with painted walls and mosaic floors, others simple niches for the poor. And through it all, at one particular spot, a modest monument seems to have been raised over the grave that the Christians honored as Peter's, a small structure of columns and stone, humbled by the standards of Roman architecture, but tended and remembered by those who cared. To understand why this small grave would one day carry a dome that could be seen for miles, we have to step back and look at the great change that came over the Roman world in the centuries that followed. Because the fortunes of this hill were bound tightly to the fortunes of the empire and its faith. For a long time, Christianity remained a minority religion within the empire, sometimes tolerated, sometimes persecuted, always growing quietly among the poor and the ordinary, and increasingly among people of every rank. The Roman state was suspicious of it, in part because Christians refused to take part in the public rituals that honored the emperor and the traditional gods, rituals that Romans saw as essential to the safety and unity of the state. To refuse them seemed to many Romans like a kind of disloyalty, even a danger to the community. And so there were periods, some brief and some severe, when the authorities moved against Christians, and the memory of those who died in these persecutions became precious to the faithful, who called them martyrs, a word that simply meant witnesses. But belief kept spreading, patiently decade after decade, until by the early 4th century a very large number of people across the empire, in the cities especially, followed the new faith. And then came the great turning, the change that would lift this quiet hill from obscurity toward the center of the Western world. In the early 4th century, the Emperor Constantine, after years of civil war among rival claimants to the throne, came to power and extended toleration to Christians, and then began to favor the faith openly. The reasons behind his decisions have been debated endlessly by historians, who weigh his personal belief against his political calculation, and the truth was likely a mixture of both, as human motives usually are, but the effect is not in doubt. Christianity moved from the margins toward the heart of imperial life, and Constantine, wishing to honor the faith he now supported, chose to build. Among the churches raised under his authority in Rome was one built directly over the cemetery on the Vatican Hill, over the very spot believed to be the grave of Peter. This was an enormous undertaking, and it tells us how strong the memory of that grave had already become, for the builders did not choose an easy, flat, empty site. They chose this awkward slope, crowded with tombs, and they went to great trouble and expense to build there anyway. They cut into the hillside on one side and raised huge foundations on the other, filling in and burying an entire section of the old cemetery to create a level platform. Beneath the new church, sealed in the earth, the old streets of tombs were left in the dark, preserved by the very act of being covered over. This is one of the quiet wonders of the Vatican, and we will return to it later in our journey. The reason so much of the ancient cemetery survives today, the reason archaeologists in modern times could descend beneath the floors and walk along a buried Roman street of the dead, is precisely because Constantine's builders filled it in and built on top of it. What looked like destruction became preservation. The old world was not swept away but pressed gently down into the earth and kept there. Waiting, the church that Constantine raised is the one we now call Old St. Peter's, to distinguish it from the great building that would replace it more than 1,000 years later. It was a vast basilica, a long hall with rows of columns, a wide central space, and at its heart, beneath a special canopy, the shrine over the grave. For over 1,000 years, this was the church that pilgrims knew. Generations upon generations of the faithful walked into that long, dim hall, past the tombs of the honored dead set into its floors and walls toward the shrine at the center, and knelt where their ancestors in faith had knelt before them. The building grew old and worn, patched and repaired, filled with monuments and altars and the accumulated memory of 1,000 years of prayer. Try to imagine for a moment what it was to be a pilgrim arriving at that old basilica in, say, the 7th or 8th century. You would have traveled for weeks or months, perhaps from Gaul, perhaps from Britain, perhaps from far across the Alps, along roads that were often dangerous and always slow. You would have crossed rivers and mountains, slept in monasteries and rough shelters, joined other travelers for safety, and at last you would have come down toward Rome and seen the city that had once ruled the world, now shrunken and half ruined, its great monuments crumbling, its population a fraction of what it had once been, sheep grazing among the old temples. And then you would have crossed the Tiber and climbed toward the Vatican and entered the great old church. And there in the quiet, you would have reached the goal of your entire journey. For many pilgrims, this single moment was the culmination of a lifetime of longing. Beyond the church, life on the hill went on in smaller ways. A district grew up around the basilica to serve the pilgrims and the clergy, a settlement of houses and hostels and workshops and gardens. The Vatican, once a place of the dead and the working poor, became a place of arrival, of ending journeys, of rest after long roads. And this brings us to the wider world in which the hill now sat, a world very different from the confident empire of Constantine's day. For by the time those early medieval pilgrims came, the Western Roman Empire had faded away, and Rome itself had entered a long, uncertain twilight. The story of how the Western Empire dissolved is a long one, and we have walked through it in other quiet nights. What matters for us here is that as the old imperial government of the West weakened and finally disappeared in the late 5th century, the city of Rome lost its emperors, its armies, and much of its population. But it did not lose its meaning, and into the space left by the vanished empire, a new kind of authority slowly grew, centered on the Bishop of Rome, the figure the world would come to call the Pope, whose office was traced back, in an unbroken chain of tradition, to that same fisherman buried on the Vatican Hill. The bishops of Rome had long held a special standing among the leaders of the Christian world, in part because of the size and importance of the city, and in part because of the belief that Peter, whom Christians regarded as the first among the apostles, had led the church there and died there. As the Western world fell into disorder, into invasions and shifting kingdoms and the collapse of old certainties, the popes gradually took on more and more responsibility, not only for spiritual matters, but for the practical survival of Rome itself. They fed the poor in times of famine. They negotiated with the leaders of the peoples who now moved through Italy. They repaired walls and aqueducts when they could. They became, without quite intending it, the guardians of a city, and in time, the rulers of lands around it. And so the humble hill of tombs found itself over the centuries, at the very center of a new and strange kind of power, a power that was religious and worldly at once, that claimed authority over souls across half a continent, and also governed streets and fields and towns in central Italy. How that power grew, how it was challenged and defended, how it built and rebuilt the great church over the grave, and how it created at last the tiny independent state we know today, is the long story that lies ahead of us. But before we follow it further, let us pause here, in the dim light of the old basilica, among the pilgrims and the tombs, and let the quiet of that ancient place settle over the night. The hill remembers all of it in its own silent way. Beneath every later floor lie older floors. Beneath the marble lie the graves. Beneath the graves lies the clay of the riverbank, and the memory of reeds and floods and kilns in the slow brown Tiber, sliding past a place that no one thought would ever matter. And yet it came to matter more than almost any small patch of ground on earth, not because of gold or armies, but because of a memory that people refused to let go, carried gently from one generation to the next, like a candle passed from hand to hand along a dark road. To carry the story forward, we must return to the wider world beyond the hill, to the centuries after Rome's Western Empire had faded, when Italy became a land of many powers and the popes learned to survive among them. For the Vatican did not rise smoothly or safely toward greatness. It rose amid danger, amid invasions and rival kings, amid the constant uncertainty of a world in which no single authority ruled, and no one could be sure what the next season would bring. And in that dangerous world, even the sacred hill across the river was not beyond the reach of harm. In the 9th century, raiders came up the Tiber from the sea, seafaring warriors who plundered the coasts and rivers of the Mediterranean world in those years, and they reached Rome and fell upon the districts outside the old city walls. The Vatican, lying beyond those ancient walls, was exposed, and the great old Basilica of St. Peter, with its accumulated treasures given by the faithful over centuries, was stripped of its wealth. The shock of this was very great, for it seemed almost unthinkable that the shrine of the apostle could be violated. And in response, the Pope of that time, Leo, undertook a project that would change the shape of the hill forever. He raised a great wall around the Vatican district, enclosing the basilica and the settlement around it within a protected circuit, a fortified zone that came to be known after him as the Leonine City. This wall matters more than it might first appear, because it marks a turning in the character of the place. The Vatican was no longer only a shrine and a pilgrimage site. It was becoming a defended enclosure, a distinct space with its own walls, its own gates, its own identity separate from the rest of Rome. The seed of the later independent city can be seen faintly in those 9th century fortifications, in the decision to draw a protective line around the Hill of Peter and hold it apart. Life inside those walls went on much as before, with pilgrims arriving and clergy praying and the poor being fed. But now there was a boundary, a sense of a place set aside and guarded, and the centuries rolled on as they do, each leaving its mark. The medieval popes grew in authority and also in entanglement, drawn into the endless struggles of Italian and European politics, sometimes rising to great heights of influence, and sometimes brought low by rival factions, by powerful families, by kings and emperors who sought to control them. There were periods of strength and periods of deep weakness, times when the papacy commanded the respect of all the Western Christian world, and times when it was a prize fought over by the noble houses of Rome, who installed and deposed popes almost as they pleased. Through all of it, the old basilica stood on its hill, growing ever older, its ancient roof timbers sagging, its walls leaning, its floors worn hollow by the feet of countless pilgrims. Beyond the walls of the Vatican, the ordinary life of Rome continued in its shrunken medieval form, a city of perhaps 20 or 30,000 people living amid the ruins of a metropolis that had once held 1 million. Cattle grazed in the old forum. Great ancient buildings were mined for their stone and their marble, quarried by Romans who needed material for churches and houses and had no use for the temples of forgotten gods. The city was a strange landscape of the living and the dead, of humble medieval homes built against the flanks of colossal ruins, of vineyards planted where senators had once debated, of the Tiber flooding the low districts every few years and leaving mud in the streets. And through this landscape moved the pilgrims, always the pilgrims, following the old roads toward the shrines, toward the tombs of the martyrs, toward the Hill of Peter above all. There is something deeply human in this long medieval chapter, in the picture of a great fated city holding on to its meaning through memory alone. Rome had no army worth the name, no empire, no wealth to compare with the days of the Caesars. What it had was the past, and the graves, and the belief that here, in this place, the most important events in the history of the Western Church had unfolded. People came for that. They walked across a continent for that. And the popes, whatever their failings and struggles, kept the flame of that meaning alive, tending the shrines, welcoming the travelers, and slowly over generations, building a claim to authority that would reach its height in the centuries to come. And so the story moves quietly on, toward the great age of building that would sweep away the old basilica and raise in its place the vast domed church that dominates the hill today. But that is a tale for the deeper part of the night, and for now it is enough to rest here, in the medieval quiet, among the worn stones and the pilgrim roads, with the walls of the Leonine city standing guard around the hill, and the old brown river sliding past as it always has, patient and unhurried, carrying the reflection of the moon down toward the distant sea. Let that image stay with you as we pause. The river in the dark, the old church on its hill, its lamps burning low, the pilgrims asleep in their hostels, dreaming of home, or of the road, or of the grave they came so far to see. And beneath it all, deep in the earth, the buried streets of the ancient dead, silent and undisturbed, keeping their long vigil beneath the floors of the living, waiting for a distant future, when curious hands would uncover them again. To pick up the story again, we must move forward into the age when the old medieval world was giving way to something new, an age of rediscovery and ambition, of painters and architects and scholars, who looked back to the ancient past, not with the resignation of people living among ruins, but with a hunger to revive its glory and surpass it. This was the age we now call the Renaissance, and it fell upon Rome and the Vatican like a slow tide, gradually at first, then with gathering force, transforming the tired old city and the ancient hill of Peter into a vast workshop of art and stone. To understand how the Vatican came to look as it does today, we have to follow the popes of these centuries as they set out deliberately and at enormous cost to rebuild the very heart of their world. For a long time, the popes had not even lived at the Vatican. Through much of the Middle Ages, their main residence had been elsewhere in Rome, at the Lateran, on the far side of the city, where an ancient palace and a great cathedral formed the true administrative center of the church. There was also a long and difficult period in the 14th century, when the popes did not live in Rome at all, but had removed themselves to Avignon, in the south of what is now France, drawn there by political pressures and the turmoil of Italy. For most of a century, the papacy resided in that distant city in Rome, deprived of the popes and the pilgrims and the money they brought, sank into an even deeper decline. The old churches decayed, the population dwindled further, the Vatican Basilica, already ancient, grew still more fragile in the absence of the attention it needed. When at last the papacy returned to Rome, near the end of that troubled century, the city its leaders found was a sad and diminished place, and the return itself was tangled in a long and painful division within the church, a period when rival claimants each declared themselves the true pope, and the loyalty of Christian Europe was split among them. This division, which historians call the Western Schism, lasted for decades and shook the authority of the papacy to its foundations. It was resolved only through great councils of the church, gatherings of bishops and scholars, who worked to heal the breach and restore a single line of leadership. When unity was finally restored in the early 15th century, the popes who followed faced an enormous task. They had to rebuild not only the physical city but the prestige and authority of their office, which had been badly damaged by the long absence and the long division. And it was in this work of rebuilding that the popes made a fateful choice, one that would shape the hill forever. They decided to make the Vatican their true home. They moved the center of their residence and their government there, beside the shrine of Peter, and they began to build a palace worthy of their renewed ambitions. Over the coming generations, that palace would grow into an immense complex of halls and chapels and courtyards, of libraries and galleries and apartments, spreading across the slope beside the old basilica. The Vatican was becoming not just a shrine but a seat of power, a court, a place where the affairs of a great institution were conducted amid ever-increasing splendor. The popes of the Renaissance were complicated figures, and any honest telling of their story must hold together very different truths. Some of them were men of genuine faith and learning, patrons of scholarship, who gathered manuscripts and founded the great library that still bears the Vatican's name, a treasure house of ancient and medieval texts that scholars would draw upon for centuries. Some of them were worldly princes as much as churchmen drawn into the wars and rivalries of Italy, building fortunes for their families, living in a manner that later generations and many of their own contemporaries found troubling. The papacy in this age was both a spiritual office and a worldly power, and the tension between those two roles ran through everything the popes did. This tension is part of the deep story of the Vatican, and we will not pretend it away, but neither will we dwell on scandal, for our path tonight leads through stone and memory more than through the failings of individual men. What matters most for our journey is what these popes chose to build, because their building has outlasted them all, and the greatest of their decisions, the one that reshaped the hill more than any other, was the choice to tear down the ancient Basilica of Constantine and raise in its place an entirely new church, the largest and most magnificent that the Christian world had ever seen. This was not an easy decision, and it was not made all at once. The old basilica was more than 1,000 years old, sacred with the memory of countless prayers and the tombs of many popes and saints. To demolish it seemed to some almost a kind of sacrilege, but the building was genuinely failing. Its ancient walls were leaning dangerously. Its roof was rotting. Reports from the time described walls out of true by several feet. Timbers gnawed by age, a structure that could not safely stand much longer. And so, in the early 16th century, the Pope of that time, Julius, a man of enormous will and ambition, made the decision to pull down the old church and build a new one on a scale that would astonish the world. Imagine what it meant to begin such a work. The old basilica, with its 1,000 years of memory, was slowly dismantled, its columns taken down, its floors broken up, its monuments moved, and in its place rose scaffolding and cranes and the vast machinery of a construction project that would consume more than a century. Spanning the reigns of many popes and the working lives of many of the greatest artists and architects the world has ever known, the building of New St. Peter's became one of the longest and most expensive construction projects in all of human history. A labor that outlasted the lifetimes of everyone who began it and drew in the finest minds of the age, one after another, as each in turn added to the design and then died before it was complete. The names of those who worked on it read like a roll of the greatest artists of the Renaissance. The first great architect of the new church drew up plans for a vast building crowned by an enormous central dome. After his death, others took up the work, altering and adapting the design. And then, when he was already an old man, past 70, one of the most extraordinary artists in the whole history of the world took charge of the project, the sculptor and painter and architect Michelangelo. He had spent his life creating works of almost unbearable beauty and power. And now, in his final years, he devoted himself to the great church, redesigning its structure, strengthening its foundations, and above all, conceiving the mighty dome that would crown it. He did not live to see the dome completed. He died in his old age with the drum built, but the dome itself still unfinished, and it was left to those who came after him to raise the great curved shell into the sky, following his designs. When at last it was finished, rising higher than almost any structure of its age, it became the defining silhouette of Rome, visible from far across the city and the countryside, a shape that has meant the Vatican to the whole world ever since. To understand what it took to build such a thing, we should pause and think about the ordinary human labor behind it, the part of the story that rarely appears in the grand accounts. For every famous architect, there were thousands of nameless workers, men who quarried and hauled the stone, who mixed the mortar, who climbed the scaffolding day after day in heat and cold, who risked their lives at great heights, who carved and lifted and set in place the countless blocks that make up the building. There were the men who dug the deep foundations, working in the damp earth of the old cemetery, encountering as they dug the ancient tombs of the Romans, the buried streets of the dead that Constantine's builders had covered over 1,000 years before. There were carters and their animals hauling marble through the streets, boatmen bringing stone up the Tiber, blacksmiths making tools, cooks feeding the crews, and the countless suppliers of a project that ran for generations. And there was the vast question of how to pay for it all, which brings us to one of the most consequential episodes in the whole history of the Vatican, and indeed of the Western world. The building of New St. Peter's cost sums that were almost impossible to imagine, and the Church sought money for it in many ways, including through the practice of granting what were called indulgences, spiritual benefits offered to the faithful, which came in this period to be associated with the giving of money. The aggressive promotion of indulgences to help fund the building, especially in the lands of Germany, provoked deep anger among many devout Christians who felt that something sacred was being turned into a matter of money. And it was in reaction to this, among other grievances, that a monk and scholar in Germany named Martin Luther raised his objections in the early 16th century, setting off a chain of events that led to the great division of Western Christianity that we call the Reformation. We will not follow that vast story tonight, for it leads far away from our hill across all of Europe into wars and upheavals that reshaped the continent. But it is worth pausing to notice how closely it is tied to the very stones we are walking among. The great church that rises over the grave of Peter, the most magnificent building in the Western Christian world, is bound up in its very construction with the division of that world. The effort to build a single, glorious center for Western Christianity coincided with and helped to trigger the shattering of that unity into many pieces. There is something quietly profound in this, a reminder that the grandest human works are so often woven together with unintended consequences, that the same moment can contain both a soaring ambition and a deep fracture, and that history rarely gives us pure triumphs untouched by loss. Even so, the building went on decade after decade, through the century of religious division and beyond. The dome was completed. The Great Hall took shape. And in the 17th century, a new burst of artistic energy transformed the church and its surroundings into the overwhelming spectacle we know today. The dominant genius of this age was the sculptor and architect Bernini, a man of extraordinary invention who shaped not only much of the interior of the church, but also the great space in front of it. For it was Bernini who designed the vast oval piazza that spreads before St. Peter's, embraced by two great sweeping colonnades of columns that reach out like arms to gather in the crowds of pilgrims. He described these colonnades, according to tradition, as the arms of the church reaching out to embrace the faithful. And whether or not those were his exact words, the image captures perfectly what the space feels like. A vast open embrace, a place where enormous crowds can gather in the open air before the great facade. And at the center of that piazza, Bernini and his contemporaries placed a single ancient object, the same one we met near the beginning of our journey. The Egyptian obelisk, which had stood at the center of Nero's circus for 1,500 years, half buried and forgotten beside the growing church, was raised again and set upright in the middle of the new square. The moving and re-erecting of this enormous stone was one of the great engineering feats of its age, requiring hundreds of workers and horses, elaborate machinery of ropes and pulleys and beams, and the most careful planning. According to a story often told about the event, the crowd was ordered to keep silent during the delicate raising of the stone, on pain of severe punishment, so that the workers could hear the commands of the engineer. And at the critical moment, when the ropes began to smoke from the strain, a sailor in the crowd, understanding the danger, is said to have cried out to wet the ropes, saving the day. Whether the tale is true in every detail or not, it captures the drama and difficulty of moving that ancient stone, and the obelisk has stood there ever since, in the center of the piazza, the same shaft of granite that watched over the ground when it was a place of tombs and racing chariots, now watching over a place of pilgrimage and prayer. Stand in that piazza in your imagination, on a quiet evening, when the crowds have gone and the light is fading. Before you rises the great facade of the church, and above it the immense dome catching the last of the sun. Around you sweep the double colonnades, their rows of columns receding into shadow, and in the center the ancient obelisk points silently at the darkening sky, as it has done for 2,000 years. There is a stillness in such a place at such an hour, a sense of the vast weight of time pressing down gently, of all the generations who have stood where you are standing, of the labor and longing and belief that raised these stones. It is a place designed to make a human being feel small, and yet also somehow held, gathered in by those reaching arms of stone. Now let us step inside, for the interior of the great church is a world of its own, and it holds within it the memory of everything we have followed so far. When you pass through the great doors into the vast hall, the scale is almost impossible to grasp. The building is so large that its true dimensions confuse the eye, and marks set into the floor show how the greatest churches of other cities would fit comfortably within this single space. Far above, the dome soars up into light, its inner surface covered with images and inscriptions, drawing the gaze upward toward the opening at its very top, through which daylight falls. Beneath the dome, at the center of the church, stands a great canopy of dark twisted bronze columns, the work of Bernini, rising over the high altar. And beneath that altar, deep down, at the heart of everything, lies the reason for it all, the grave believed since the earliest times to be the tomb of Peter. For this is the quiet secret that ties the whole enormous structure together. All of this immensity, the dome and the columns and the marble and the gold, the labor of 100 years and the wealth of a continent, was raised over a single simple grave in the ground. A poor man's grave from the days when this was only a cemetery on a muddy hill. The greatest church in the Western world was built not on gold or on the tomb of a king, but on the memory of a fisherman, and every line of the vast building points, in the end, downward and inward to that humble spot in the earth. There is something in this that has moved visitors for centuries, believers and unbelievers alike. The contrast between the overwhelming grandeur above and the plain human grave below, between the empire of stone and the simple memory at its center. And this brings us at last to the buried world beneath the floors, which is perhaps the most haunting and least known part of the whole Vatican story, and which we have been holding in reserve since the very beginning of our journey. For beneath the great church, beneath the floors that the pilgrims walk upon, there lies not one level but several, descending down into the past, like the pages of a book read backward. Just below the main floor of the present church lie the grottos, a lower level where many popes of past centuries are buried, a dim and solemn space of tombs and chapels where visitors move quietly among the resting places of the dead. And below even that, deeper still, lies the ancient cemetery itself, the Roman necropolis, the very streets of tombs that Constantine's builders covered over more than 16 centuries ago. For most of the long history of the church, this deepest level was unknown and unreached, sealed in the earth, remembered only in old traditions. People knew that the grave of Peter was supposed to lie somewhere beneath the high altar, but no one had seen the ancient ground for many centuries. It was only in the 20th century, during work beneath the church, that the decision was made to explore what lay below, and archaeologists began, carefully and slowly, to excavate beneath the floors. What they found astonished them. Descending into the earth, they uncovered an entire ancient street of the dead, a row of Roman tombs standing much as they had been left, their walls still bearing painted decorations and inscriptions, their family names still legible after nearly 2,000 years, a whole quiet neighborhood of the ancient Roman dead, preserved in the dark beneath the greatest church of the Christian world. To walk along that buried street today, as a small number of visitors are permitted to do, is one of the strangest experiences the Vatican offers. You descend from the bright modern world down through the levels of the past, down past the tombs of the popes, down into the cool, close air of the ancient necropolis, and there you find yourself walking along a street that has not seen the open sky since the 4th century, lined with the tombs of Roman families who lived and died long before anyone imagined the church. that would one day rise above them. Some of these tombs were built by pagan Romans, decorated with images from their beliefs, with scenes of gardens and feasting and the old gods. And among them, gradually, appear signs of the early Christians, symbols and images that show the slow mingling of the two worlds in this very ground, the old faith and the new lying side by side in the earth. And at the end of this journey through the buried past, the excavators came at last to the spot beneath the high altar, to the place that tradition had always held to be the grave of Peter. Here the archaeology becomes complex and much debated, as such things always are, and I will describe it carefully and honestly, because honesty is part of the calm we are seeking tonight. Beneath the altar, the excavators found the remains of an ancient monument, a simple structure that seems to have been raised over a grave in the 2nd century, exactly the kind of modest shrine that early sources suggest the Christians of that time had built to mark the spot they honored. Around this monument, later Christians had wished to be buried, clustering their graves close to it, which tells us that from a very early date this particular spot was regarded as special, as holy, as worth being near in death. Whether the bones found in the area are truly those of Peter is a question that cannot be answered with certainty, and honest scholars have differed about it. Various remains were discovered in the course of the excavations, and their identification has been the subject of careful study and continuing debate. What can be said with more confidence is this: there was, in the earliest Christian centuries, a grave on this spot that the community of Rome honored as the grave of Peter. They marked it. They wished to be buried near it. They built over it. And every later structure from Constantine's Basilica to the great church of the Renaissance was aligned with that same spot. Generation after generation, each building rising directly over the memory kept by the one before. The precise historical truth of the 1st century may lie forever beyond our reach. But the continuity of the memory, the unbroken line of people honoring this exact place for nearly 2,000 years, is itself something remarkable, something that can move even those who make no religious claims at all. There is a lesson in that buried street, in those ancient tombs beneath the floors, that reaches beyond any single faith. It is a lesson about how the past survives, not through grandeur, but through care, through the patient handing down of memory from one generation to the next, through the accident of preservation that turns burial into safekeeping. The Roman families whose names are still legible on those tomb walls never imagined that their modest graves would be preserved for 2,000 years beneath the greatest church in the world. They were ordinary people, remembering their dead as people always have, and their memory has outlasted the empire they lived in, outlasted the gods they worshipped, outlasted almost everything of their world, precisely because their tombs happened to lie beneath a spot that later ages held sacred. The past is full of such quiet accidents, such unintended acts of preservation, and there is a strange comfort in them, a reminder that even the humblest lives can leave traces that endure far beyond anything their owners could have foreseen. And so the great church stands, layer upon layer, the present built upon the medieval upon the ancient upon the clay of the riverbank, and at the bottom of it all a single grave that a community refused to forget. Above it rises the dome, and around it spreads the piazza, and in the center stands the old Egyptian stone that has watched over this ground through every change. It is one of the most concentrated places of human memory anywhere on earth, a small hill where nearly 2,000 years of history are stacked one atop another, waiting quietly beneath the feet of everyone who passes. But the Vatican is more than its great church, and to complete our picture of this small and remarkable place, we must turn to the vast complex of buildings that grew up beside the Basilica over the centuries. The palace and its galleries and gardens, which together hold one of the greatest gatherings of art and learning that the world has ever known. For as the popes made the Vatican their home and their court, they filled it not only with the machinery of church government, but with beauty, gathering paintings and sculptures and manuscripts, commissioning artists to decorate their halls and chapels, and slowly assembling collections that would one day be counted among the treasures of humankind. The greatest of all these treasures and the one most often spoken of is the chapel we call the Sistine Chapel, named after the Pope who had it built in the 15th century. From the outside it is a plain, almost fortress-like building, but its interior holds some of the most celebrated works of art ever made. The walls were painted by a group of the finest artists of their day with scenes from sacred history, a magnificent achievement in itself. But it is the ceiling that draws the eyes of all who enter, for it was painted in the early 16th century by the same Michelangelo who would later design the dome of the great church. He labored on that ceiling for years, working high above the floor on scaffolding, painting scene after scene of the creation and the earliest stories of the sacred texts, filling the vast curved surface with figures of astonishing power and grace. The physical strain of the work was immense, and accounts describe the toll it took on his body, the aching neck and the paint that dripped down upon his face as he worked overhead for hour after hour, day after day, month after month. And years later, as an older man, Michelangelo returned to the same chapel and painted the great wall behind the altar with an enormous scene of the final judgment, a vast composition of countless figures rising and falling, a work of overwhelming emotional force that has been studied and marveled at ever since. To stand in that chapel today, amid the crowds who fall silent as they enter, and to look up at that ceiling and across at that wall, is to feel the presence of a single human mind of almost unimaginable power, reaching across 5 centuries to speak to everyone who looks. The chapel is also, to this day, the place where the cardinals of the church gather when a pope has died, to choose his successor, sealing themselves within its painted walls and voting in secret until a new pope is chosen, at which moment smoke rises from a chimney above the chapel to signal the result to the crowds waiting in the piazza below. There is a beautiful continuity in this, the most solemn act of the church, still carried out beneath the ceiling that Michelangelo painted so long ago. Beyond the chapel stretch the great galleries and museums of the Vatican, halls upon halls of ancient sculpture and painting and treasure, gathered over centuries. There are rooms decorated by the painter Raphael, another of the supreme artists of the Renaissance, whose serene and balanced compositions fill the walls of the papal apartments. There are galleries of ancient Roman and Greek statues, many of them recovered from the soil of Italy over the centuries. Gods and heroes and emperors carved in marble long ago. There is the great library, holding manuscripts and printed books beyond counting, some of them among the oldest and most precious in existence, preserving the words of ancient authors that would otherwise have been lost. Scholars have come to that library for centuries to study its treasures, working quietly among the accumulated learning of the ages. To walk through these galleries, even in imagination, is to feel the weight of how much human effort and genius has been gathered into this one small place. Every object has its own story, its own journey through time, its own makers and owners and admirers. Across the centuries, the statues stood once in ancient villas and temples, before they were buried and lost and found again. The manuscripts were copied by hand, letter by letter, by monks and scribes in scriptoriums long ago, preserving words that might otherwise have vanished. The paintings were made by hands that have been dust for centuries, and all of it now rests together in the galleries of the Vatican, a vast memory of the human past held within the walls of the smallest state on earth. For that is what the Vatican has become. In the end, a small state, indeed the smallest independent state in the world, a tiny enclave within the city of Rome, with its own walls and its own government and its own quiet independence. How this came to be is the final chapter of our long story, and it belongs to the modern age, to the difficult centuries when the old worldly power of the popes was challenged and finally lost, and when the Vatican, having given up its wide dominions, was left with only the hill and its buildings, a small sovereign island in a changed world. To understand that ending, we must follow the story out of the age of art and into the harder centuries that followed, when the popes lost their lands and had to find a new way to exist. For a very long time, the popes had ruled not only the Vatican but a wide swath of central Italy, a collection of territories known as the Papal States. over which they governed as worldly princes as well as spiritual leaders. These lands stretched across the middle of the Italian peninsula, and for over 1,000 years the popes were among the rulers of Italy, with their own subjects and their own armies and their own place in the shifting politics of Europe. This worldly rule brought both strength and difficulty. It gave the popes independence and resources, but it also entangled them endlessly in war and politics, and it meant that they governed ordinary people, collected taxes, administered justice, and did all the difficult work of any earthly government, with all the compromises and failures that such work involves. But the modern age was not kind to old arrangements of this kind. In the 19th century, a great movement swept across the Italian peninsula, a movement to unite the many separate states of Italy into a single nation. This movement, which historians call the Risorgimento, gathered force over decades, and one by one the old states and kingdoms of Italy were drawn together into a new united country. The papal states stood in the way of this unification, for they occupied the very center of the peninsula, and the leaders of the new Italy were determined to make Rome their capital. And so, over the course of the 19th century, the territories of the popes were gradually taken into the new Italian nation, until at last, in the year 1870, the city of Rome itself was occupied by Italian forces, and the long worldly rule of the popes came to an end. This was a moment of great bitterness and difficulty. The Pope of that time withdrew into the Vatican and refused to recognize the loss of his lands, considering himself, as later popes would for many years, a kind of prisoner within his own palace, unwilling to accept the new order that had stripped away the temporal power the papacy had held for so many centuries. For decades, an uneasy and unresolved situation persisted, with the popes remaining within the Vatican, refusing to acknowledge the Italian state's authority over Rome, and the Italian state uncertain how to deal with the strange presence of the papacy in the midst of its new capital. The old worldly kingdom of the popes was gone, and yet the popes themselves remained, on their hill amid their treasures, in a kind of limbo that no one quite knew how to resolve. The resolution came only in the 20th century, when, after long negotiations, an agreement was reached between the papacy and the Italian government that created the Vatican City state as we know it today. This agreement, signed in the year 1929, established the tiny territory of Vatican City as an independent sovereign state, small enough to walk across in a matter of minutes, encompassing the great church, the palace and its galleries, the gardens, and a handful of other buildings, all enclosed within walls in the heart of Rome. In this way, the papacy gave up its claim to the wide lands it had once ruled, and received instead a small but genuine independence, a territory of its own, where it would be sovereign, free from the authority of any other state. The old empire of central Italy had shrunk to a single hill, and yet on that hill the popes remained truly independent, rulers of the smallest country in the world. There is a quiet irony in this ending, and also a strange fittingness. The Vatican began as a small and unremarkable place, a hill of tombs across the river from the great city. Over the centuries it grew into the center of a vast spiritual authority and a considerable worldly power, ruling lands and armies and treasures. And then, in the modern age, it gave up nearly all of that worldly power and returned, in a sense, to being small again, a single hill, a single church, a single grave at the center of it all. The wide dominions are gone, the armies are gone, save for a small ceremonial guard in their old-fashioned uniforms, a quiet echo of a vanished age. What remains is the hill and the church, and the memory, which is where the whole story began. And so we come nearly to the end of our long walk through the hidden history of this place. But before we let the night close in, let us return once more to the quiet human texture of it, to the ordinary life that goes on within those walls even now, and that has gone on there in one form or another for 2,000 years. For beneath all the grandeur and all the history, the Vatican has always been, in part, simply a place where people live and work and pray. Even today, within its walls, there are people going about their daily lives, tending the gardens, cleaning the vast halls, guarding the gates, studying in the library, caring for the treasures, preparing food, ringing the bells. The great machine of the church runs on their quiet labor, as it always has. And most of them will never be remembered by name. Just as the workers who built the great church were never remembered, just as the Roman families in the buried necropolis were forgotten by all but the stones that held their names. And every day still the pilgrims come, as they have come for nearly 2,000 years, crossing the world to stand in that piazza and enter that church and descend, some of them, to the quiet tombs below. They come for many reasons, some out of deep faith, some out of curiosity, some simply to see one of the great wonders of human making, but they come in an unbroken stream that has flowed toward this hill since the days when it was only a cemetery and a shrine. Since the first Christians walked cautiously to a simple grave in the ground, the forms have changed beyond all recognition. The muddy hill has become a marble city. The modest shrine has become the greatest church in the Western world. But the essential act is the same, the journey toward a remembered place. The standing in a spot where others have stood, the reaching across time toward something felt to be worth the long road. To carry our journey deeper into the quiet corners of this place, let us step away for a while from the great church and the famous halls, and wander instead through the parts of the Vatican that visitors rarely see and travelers seldom speak of, the gardens and the workshops, and the small daily rhythms that have shaped life on this hill across the centuries. For a place is never only its monuments. It is also its mornings and its evenings, its weather and its work, the smell of its earth and the sound of its bells, and the Vatican, for all its fame, has always been these smaller things as well. Behind the great church and the palace, occupying more than half of the tiny state, lie the gardens, a green and quiet world hidden from the crowds who press into the piazza and the galleries. These gardens have existed in one form or another for many centuries, ever since the medieval popes first planted vineyards and orchards on the slopes of the hill, and they were shaped and reshaped over the generations into a landscape of lawns and groves and fountains, of winding paths and shaded walks, of ancient trees and carefully tended flower beds. To walk in these gardens is to enter a stillness quite different from the grandeur of the church, a place where the noise of the city fades and the only sounds are the wind in the leaves, the splash of water in the old fountains, and the birds that have made their homes among the trees. For the popes, across the centuries, these gardens were a place of retreat and reflection, a private world where they could walk and think and pray away from the endless demands of their office. Many of them spent hours here in the cool of the evening, moving slowly along the paths. And there is something touching in the thought of these men, who carried on their shoulders the weight of an ancient institution and the hopes and fears of many millions, seeking a little peace among the trees, as any tired person might. The gardens hold fountains that date back centuries, their carved basins green with age, their waters flowing as they have flowed for hundreds of years. There are small buildings scattered among the greenery, quiet retreats and old towers, and there is a replica of a famous grotto, a place of prayer set among the rocks and the flowers. In one corner stands an old railway station, for the tiny state has its own short stretch of railway line, running through a gate in the walls, a curious reminder that even the smallest country in the world had to find its place in the modern age of trains and machines. The gardens are tended, as they have always been, by gardeners whose labor is largely invisible, men and women who know the soil and the plants and the seasons of this small enclosed world, who prune and water and plant and weed, who keep the ancient landscape alive through their patient daily work. Theirs is a form of memory too, the memory held not in stone or paint but in living things, in trees that were planted by hands long dead and tended by hands not yet born, in the continuity of care that keeps a garden going across the generations. There is a quiet wisdom in this kind of work, in the understanding that a garden is never finished, that it must be renewed constantly or it will vanish. That beauty of this kind depends on unending attention. The gardeners of the Vatican, like the gardeners of any old garden anywhere, are the keepers of a slow and gentle art, and their work has gone on beside the grander history of the hill for as long as anyone can remember. Beyond the gardens, scattered through the buildings of the tiny state, there have long been workshops of many kinds, for a place so full of precious things requires constant care and skill to maintain. There are workshops where the ancient paintings are studied and cleaned and preserved, where experts labor with the greatest patience to protect works that are centuries old, cleaning away the grime of ages, repairing the damage of time, ensuring that these treasures survive for future generations. The great cleaning and restoration of the Sistine Chapel ceiling in recent decades was one of the most famous of these labors, a project of many years in which conservators worked high above the floor, just as Michelangelo had, carefully removing the accumulated dirt and smoke of centuries to reveal the colors as they had been when they were first painted, brighter and more vivid than anyone living had ever seen them. That work provoked much discussion and some disagreement among scholars, as such things always do, but it revealed the ceiling anew, and it stands as an example of the endless labor required to keep the past alive. There are workshops, too, where the mosaics are made and repaired, for the Vatican has long maintained a studio devoted to the ancient art of mosaic, the making of images from tiny pieces of colored glass and stone. Many of the images within the great church that appear at first glance to be paintings are in fact mosaics, made of countless small fragments fitted together with immense patience and skill, chosen because mosaic endures far longer than paint and resists the damage of time and damp. The craftsmen of this studio have kept alive a tradition that reaches back to the ancient world, working with materials and techniques not so very different from those the Romans used, creating and restoring the shimmering images that catch the light within the church. Theirs is a slow and painstaking art, the fitting together of thousands upon thousands of tiny pieces to build an image, and it requires a patience and a steadiness of hand that few possess. And there have always been the more ordinary trades as well, the work that any community requires to keep itself going. There have been bakers and cooks, tailors and cleaners, plumbers and electricians in the modern age, all the countless workers whose labor keeps the small state functioning day by day. There is a pharmacy, and there have been shops, and there is the business of feeding and clothing and housing the people who live and work within the walls. It is easy, amid the grandeur of the church and the fame of the art, to forget that the Vatican is also simply a place where people go about the practical business of living. But it always has been, and there is something reassuring in remembering it, in seeing past the monuments to the ordinary human life that has always gone on beneath and around them. Now let us turn to the bells, for the bells of the Vatican are one of the oldest and most constant threads of daily life on the hill, and they connect us to something very deep in the human experience of time. For many centuries, in a world without clocks in every home, the bells of churches marked the hours of the day and the rhythms of life, calling people to prayer, marking the passing of time, announcing births and deaths and celebrations and sorrows. The great bells of St. Peter's have rung out over Rome for centuries, their deep voices carrying across the city, and they still ring today, marking the hours and the holy days, tolling in mourning when a pope dies and pealing in joy when a new one is chosen. There is a particular power in the sound of an old bell, in the knowledge that its voice has been heard by so many generations, that the same deep tone that reaches your ears has reached the ears of people long dead, that it has marked the passing of centuries with its steady, patient ringing. The bells of the Vatican are among the oldest continuous sounds of the hill, older than most of the buildings around them, a voice from the past that still speaks in the present. Think for a moment of how the sound of those bells has accompanied the whole long story we have followed tonight. They rang over the medieval city of ruins and pilgrims. They rang during the great age of building, over the scaffolding and the workers raising the dome. They rang through the centuries of art and learning, and through the difficult years when the popes lost their lands, and through the making of the tiny modern state. They ring still today over the crowds in the piazza and the quiet gardens behind the church, and the buried streets of the dead deep beneath the floors. The bells have been there through all of it, marking the hours, indifferent to the grandeur and the sorrow alike, simply ringing, as bells do, telling the time to anyone who cares to listen. And in the quiet of the night, when the crowds have gone and the city sleeps, the bells still ring the hours across the darkened hill as they have for so very long. Let us stay with the night for a while, for the Vatican after dark is a different world from the Vatican of the day, and it is in the night that this place perhaps comes closest to what it once was. During the day, the piazza fills with people from every corner of the earth, and the galleries throng with visitors, and the whole hill hums with movement and voices. But when night falls and the visitors depart, a great stillness settles over the place. The piazza empties. The colonnades stand silent in the dark, their columns receding into shadow. The great facade of the church rises pale in the moonlight, and above it the dome floats against the stars. The obelisk points silently at the sky, as it has through so many nights across 2,000 years, and in the deep quiet, the hill returns for a few hours to something like the solitude it knew when it was only a place of tombs and gardens beside the river. Within the walls in the darkened church, the lamps burn low over the tomb of Peter, as lamps have burned there in one form or another for many centuries. Small flames kept alight through the night hours, a quiet vigil maintained across the generations. Deep below, in the buried necropolis, the ancient tombs rest in total darkness, as they have rested for 1,600 years. The painted walls and the carved names invisible in the black, waiting patiently for the next day's few visitors to descend with their lights. And in the palace, in the galleries, the great works of art stand in the dark, the statues and the paintings and the manuscripts, all the gathered memory of the human past, resting in silence through the night. There is something deeply peaceful in the thought of all this, in the image of that small hill at night, so full of history and beauty and memory, resting quietly under the stars in the heart of the sleeping city. And beyond the walls, the city of Rome sleeps too, the eternal city, as it has been called, spread out along its river beneath the same stars. The Tiber still slides past in the dark, muddy and patient, as it did when this was all marsh and reeds, carrying the reflection of the moon down toward the distant sea, just as it has done through every age of this long story. The river was here before the tombs, before the circus, before the shrine and the basilica, and the great church and the tiny state. It will be here, in all likelihood, long after. It is the oldest thread of all, older even than the bells, older than the obelisk, the one thing in this whole story that was truly here from the very beginning, and that flows on, unchanging in its constant change, indifferent and eternal, through every rise and fall of the human world upon its banks. Let us think now about the deeper meaning of this place, about what it can tell us, in its quiet way, about the human experience of time and memory and mortality. For the Vatican, more than almost any place on earth, is a monument to the human refusal to forget, to the long, patient, stubborn work of remembering across the generations. Everything on that hill exists because someone long ago refused to let a memory die, and because generation after generation took up that memory and carried it forward, adding to it, building upon it, handing it down. The whole vast structure of stone and art and history rests, in the end, upon this slender thread of human memory, upon the simple fact that people cared enough to remember and to teach their children to remember, and their children's children after them. There is something both fragile and enormously strong in this. Fragile because memory is such a delicate thing, so easily lost, so dependent on the continuing care of the living. A single broken generation, a single failure to pass the memory on, and the thread might have snapped, and the hill might have returned to obscurity, the grave forgotten, the story lost like so many others. And yet strong too, immensely strong, because the memory did not break. Because across 2,000 years, through wars and plagues and collapses and transformations, through the fall of the empire and the rise of new worlds, the thread held, the memory was carried forward, and the hill kept its meaning. There is a lesson in this about the power of human continuity, about how much can be preserved when people simply refuse to forget, about how memory, though it exists only in the fragile minds and hearts of mortal people, can nonetheless outlast empires and armies and everything that seems more solid and more permanent than a mere remembering. And there is a lesson too about mortality, about the way this place holds together, in a single hill, the whole span of human life and death. For the Vatican is, at its very foundation, a place about death built over a grave, raised upon a cemetery, dedicated to the memory of those who died long ago, and yet it is also, at the same time, a place utterly full of life, thronged with the living, humming with work and prayer and the constant motion of people going about their days. The living and the dead lie close together on this hill, as they have from the beginning, the great church of the living, rising directly over the ancient tombs of the dead. The crowds in the piazza, walking above the buried streets of those long gone. There is no morbidity in this, only a kind of honesty, an acknowledgement of the truth that all human places are built, in the end, upon the memory of those who came before, that we live always upon the foundations laid by the dead, that the world we inhabit is a gift and an inheritance from countless people we will never know. This is, perhaps, the deepest thing that the Vatican has to teach, and it is a lesson that reaches far beyond any single faith or tradition. It is a lesson about our place in the long story of humankind, about the way each of us stands upon the labor and the memory of those who came before, about the way we in our turn will become the foundation for those who come after. The workers who built the great church are gone, but their work remains, and we walk among it. The Roman families in the buried necropolis are gone, but their names remain, carved in stone beneath the floors, and we can read them still. The pilgrims of 1,000 years ago are gone, but the path they walked remains, and new pilgrims walk it still. We are all, each of us, a link in a long chain of memory and labor, and care that stretches back beyond our knowing and forward beyond our seeing. And there is a great peace to be found in understanding this, in feeling ourselves held within that long continuity, neither the beginning nor the end of anything, but simply a part of the vast unfolding story of human life upon the earth. Let us return, as our journey nears its close, to the small human details that make the past feel real. That let us imagine ourselves within these old worlds, rather than merely observing them from outside. Think of a stonemason in the 16th century, high on the scaffolding of the rising dome, his hands rough and calloused, his clothes gray with stone dust, pausing in his work to look out over the city of Rome spread below him, the old ruins and the new buildings, the river winding through it all, and feeling, perhaps, a moment of quiet pride in the great thing he was helping to build, even knowing he would never see it finished. Think of a scribe in the medieval library, bent over his desk in the cold of a winter morning, his fingers stiff, his breath visible in the air, copying line after line of some ancient text by the light of a single candle, preserving words that might otherwise have been lost, his patient labor reaching forward across the centuries to us, who can still read the books he made. Think of a pilgrim woman in the 8th century, arriving at last at the old Basilica after months upon the road, her feet blistered and her body weary, kneeling at the shrine she had traveled so far to reach, and weeping perhaps, not from sorrow but from the release of a longing, finally fulfilled, feeling that the whole hard journey had been worth it for this single moment. Think of a gardener in the 17th century, planting a young tree in the papal gardens, knowing that he would be long dead before it reached its full height, planting it anyway, for those who would come after, an act of faith in a future he would never see. Think of a bell ringer, climbing the tower in the dark before dawn to ring the morning bells, his hands on the ropes worn smooth by generations of hands before his, sending the deep sound out across the sleeping city as bell ringers had done for centuries before him and would do for centuries after. These are the people who made the Vatican what it is, far more than the popes and the artists whose names we remember. It was the countless ordinary workers, the masons and scribes and gardeners and bell ringers and cooks and cleaners, the anonymous laborers of 100 generations, who actually built and maintained and preserved this place. Day by day, year by year, century by century, their names are almost all forgotten, lost like the names of the Roman families in the necropolis, but their work endures, and every stone of the great church, every page of the ancient books, every tree in the quiet gardens is a monument to their labor, a testament to the unremembered many who gave their days to something larger than themselves. There is a deep tenderness in remembering them, in acknowledging that the grandeur we admire was built by the patient work of ordinary people, most of whom lived and died in obscurity, and whose only memorial is the place itself, standing still upon its hill as the night deepens and our long walk draws toward its end. Let us gather together the threads of this story and hold them for a moment in the quiet. We began with a river and a low, damp hill across the water from an ancient city, a place of no importance, a place of clay pits and tombs and gardens, where the Romans buried their dead outside the walls of their great capital. We followed the growth of a memory there, the belief that a fisherman from a distant province had been buried in that ground, and we watched that memory endure through centuries of danger and uncertainty, carried forward by a small and often persecuted community who refused to forget the spot they honored. We saw how, when the empire turned to a new faith, a great church was raised over that humble grave, and how the old cemetery was buried and thereby preserved beneath it, the ancient dead sealed in darkness beneath the floors of the living. We followed the long medieval centuries when Rome faded into a city of ruins and pilgrims, and the popes slowly grew into a new kind of power amid the collapse of the old world, guarding the hill and its shrine, walling it about for protection against raiders from the sea. We watched the great age of rebuilding, when the ancient basilica was pulled down and the vast new church was raised in its place across more than a century of labor, drawing in the greatest artists of the age, crowned at last by Michelangelo's mighty dome, its construction bound up with the very division of the Western Christian world. We stood in the great piazza with its reaching colonnades and its ancient obelisk, and we entered the immense church and found, at the heart of all its grandeur, the simple grave that was the reason for it all. And we descended into the buried world beneath the floors, along the ancient street of tombs, down to the very spot that the memory of 2,000 years had marked. We traced the modern chapter, the loss of the wide papal lands to the unification of Italy, and the shrinking of a great worldly power down to a single hill, and the making at last of the tiny independent state that exists today, the smallest country in the world, a small sovereign island in the heart of Rome. And we wandered through the quieter corners of that small state, the hidden gardens and the patient workshops, the ringing bells and the ordinary daily life, and we thought about the countless unremembered people whose labor built and maintained it all across the centuries. Through everything, we kept returning to the deep themes of the place, to memory and mortality, to the fragile strength of human remembering, to the way the living build always upon the foundations of the dead, to the long continuity of human life that holds us all within its unfolding story. And now, as the last of the night settles around us, let us leave the hill as we found it, quiet beneath the stars. The crowds are gone. The bells have rung the late hours and fallen silent. In the great church, the lamps burn low over the ancient grave, small steady flames in the vast dark space. Deep below, the buried tombs rest in their 16 centuries of silence, the painted walls invisible, the carved names unread until the morning. In the galleries, the gathered treasures of the human past stand quiet in the shadows, the statues and the paintings and the manuscripts, holding the memory of countless makers and countless ages. In the gardens, the old trees stir gently in the night wind, and the fountains murmur their ancient song, and the birds sleep among the branches. The obelisk stands in the empty piazza, pointing at the stars as it has pointed for 2,000 years through every change and every age. And below it all, at the foot of the hill, the old river slides past in the dark, patient and eternal, carrying the moonlight down toward the sea, as it has done since long before any of this began and will do long after. Let us not leave this hill just yet, for there are quiet corners of its story we have not yet visited, and the night is still long, and there is time to wander a little further through the layers of the past before we let ourselves drift toward rest. We have followed the great arc of the Vatican's history, from the muddy riverbank to the marble city, but a place so old holds far more than any single telling can gather, and there are threads worth following that reveal the deeper texture of what life on this hill has truly been across the centuries. Let us think first about the pilgrims once more, for the pilgrims are the true lifeblood of this place, the great river of ordinary humanity that has flowed toward the hill for nearly 2,000 years, and their story deserves to be understood more fully. In the medieval centuries especially, the journey to Rome was one of the great undertakings of a human life, a venture so difficult and so dangerous that many who set out never returned, and those who did came home changed, marked by the road, carrying stories and tokens and memories that would last them the rest of their days. To make such a journey was to stake a great deal, to leave behind home and family and safety for months or even years, to entrust oneself to unknown roads and unknown people, all for the sake of reaching a distant place and standing, for a little while, upon holy ground. The roads that led to Rome were ancient, some of them built by the Romans themselves in the days of the empire, great paved highways that had once carried legions and now carried pilgrims, still usable in places after 1,000 years, a gift from the vanished empire to the ages that followed. There was one great route in particular that wound down through the lands north of the Alps, across the mountains, and southward through Italy toward Rome, a road so well traveled by pilgrims over the centuries that it acquired its own name and its own network of shelters and hospices and monasteries, where travelers could find food and rest and safety along the way. To walk this road was to join a slow-moving stream of humanity, people of every rank and origin, the rich and the poor, the young and the old, the devout and the merely curious, all moving in the same direction, all bound for the same distant goal. And there grew up along the way a whole culture of the road, a community of travelers who shared their food and their stories and their dangers, who helped one another through the hard passages, who formed, for the length of the journey, a kind of temporary family bound together by a common purpose. The dangers were real and many. There were robbers who preyed upon travelers, knowing that pilgrims often carried money for their journey and had few defenses. There was illness, which struck often among people worn down by the hardships of the road, far from home and any care they knew. There was the weather, the cold of the mountain passes, the heat of the southern summers, the rain and the mud and the swollen rivers that had to be crossed. There was hunger when food ran short or money ran out. There was simple exhaustion, the wearing down of the body by mile after mile of walking, day after day, week after week, and yet still they came, in an unbroken stream across the centuries, drawn by a longing so strong that it overcame all these dangers, the longing to reach the holy places, to stand where the apostles had stood, to kneel at the graves of the martyrs, to complete the great journey of a lifetime. And when at last they arrived, when they came down the last stretch of road, and saw the city before them and crossed the river, and climbed the hill and entered the church, what did they find? They found the goal of all their longing, the place they had traveled so far to reach, and for many it was a moment of overwhelming emotion, the release of all the hardship and the hope of the journey in a single instant of arrival. But they also found a bustling, crowded, thoroughly human place, for the pilgrimage sites of Rome were not silent and empty but full of activity, full of other pilgrims and of the many people who made their living from serving them. There were sellers of food and drink, sellers of tokens and mementos, sellers of the small objects that pilgrims took home to remember their journey and to prove that they had made it. There were guides who offered to show visitors the holy places, and interpreters who helped travelers who spoke no local tongue, and innkeepers who competed for their custom, and beggars who hoped for the charity of the newly arrived. The area around the great church was a marketplace as much as a shrine, a place of commerce and noise and human striving, and this too was part of the pilgrim's experience. This collision of the sacred longing with the ordinary business of the world. The tokens that pilgrims carried home are a small and touching detail of this long story. It became the custom for those who had made the journey to acquire some object that would serve as a sign of their pilgrimage, a small badge or emblem that they could wear or keep, proof that they had reached the holy place and a reminder of it for the rest of their lives. These tokens were often made of cheap metal mass-produced for the pilgrim trade, sold by the thousands to the travelers who came, and many of them have survived to the present day, found in rivers and fields and old graves across Europe. Small worn objects that speak of journeys made long ago by people whose names are entirely forgotten. There is something deeply moving in these little tokens, in the thought of the ordinary person who bought one, who carried it home across all those dangerous miles, who kept it perhaps for the rest of a life as the treasured memory of the greatest journey they had ever made, and who was buried perhaps, still holding it, or had it buried with them, a small sign of a great longing carried into the grave. They are among the most human relics of the whole pilgrimage tradition. These humble tokens, more eloquent in their way than all the grandeur of the church, for they speak directly of the ordinary people whose faith and longing were the true foundation of it all. Let us turn now to consider the great church itself once more, but this time not as a monument of art and architecture, but as a working place, a place where the daily rhythms of worship and ceremony have gone on across the centuries, filling the vast space with sound and movement and meaning. For the great church was never meant to be merely admired. It was built to be used, to be the setting for the most solemn ceremonies of the church, and across the centuries it has been filled again and again with the light of countless candles, the smoke of incense, the sound of voices raised in song, the movement of great processions, the gathering of enormous crowds for the most important occasions. To imagine the church only as it appears to the daytime visitor, quiet and vast and full of tourists, is to miss the other face of it, the church alive with ceremony, ablaze with light, filled with music and prayer and the presence of great crowds. The music of the great church has its own long history, for the tradition of sacred song has been cultivated there for many centuries, and the church has maintained choirs and musicians whose art was devoted to filling the vast space with beauty of sound. The particular tradition of unaccompanied choral singing that developed in the church over the centuries produced music of great purity and power. Music designed to soar up into the great dome and fill the immense space with sound. Music that could move the hearts of the crowds who gathered to hear it. To stand in the great church during one of the solemn ceremonies, with the candles burning and the incense rising, and the voices of the choir echoing up into the dome, was to experience something overwhelming, a deliberate assault upon the senses designed to lift the mind toward the sacred, an art of light and sound, and space perfected over many generations. The music has changed across the centuries, as all things do, but the tradition of filling the great space with beautiful sound has continued unbroken. And it continues still, the ancient art of sacred song echoing up into the dome that Michelangelo designed, as it has for so long. The candles, too, are worth pausing upon, for in the centuries before modern lighting, the great church was lit by candles and lamps, thousands upon thousands of them on the great occasions, and the effect must have been extraordinary, the vast dark space transformed by the light of countless small flames. The gold and the marble and the mosaics catching the light and glowing softly in the darkness. The whole immense interior brought to life by fire. There is a particular beauty in candlelight, a warmth and a softness, quite unlike the harsh brightness of modern light. And the great ceremonies of the church, seen by candlelight, must have possessed a beauty and a mystery that is hard for us now to imagine. The flickering flames, the moving shadows, the way the light caught and lost the great images overhead, the sense of a vast space only partly revealed by the pools of golden light, all of this created an atmosphere of the sacred that was as much a work of art as the building itself. And even today, though the church is lit by other means, the tradition of candles continues. Small flames kept burning at the shrines and altars, points of warm light in the great cool space, an unbroken thread reaching back to the days when fire was the only light there was. Let us consider, too, the great processions and ceremonies that have marked the life of the church across the centuries, the solemn occasions when the whole vast space filled with movement and meaning. There were the great festivals of the church year, celebrated with all possible splendor, when the church filled with crowds and the ceremonies unfolded in all their ancient complexity. The vestments and the incense and the music and the movement combining into a single overwhelming experience. There were the ceremonies that marked the great transitions of the papacy itself, the morning when a pope died, the solemn rituals of his burial in the grottos below the church among his predecessors, and then the gathering of the cardinals and the choosing of a successor, and the great celebration when a new pope was installed, the crowds packing the piazza, the announcement made, the new pope appearing to bless the assembled multitude. These moments of transition, repeated across the centuries as one pope succeeded another, are among the great recurring rhythms of the hill, the endless cycle of death and succession that has continued unbroken for so very long, each pope living and dying and being laid to rest, each in turn succeeded by another, the office continuing while the individuals who held it passed away one after another into the grottos below. There is a profound continuity in this, in the unbroken line of succession that the church traces back across 2,000 years to the fishermen buried on the hill. Whatever one believes about the origins of that line, the sheer fact of its continuity is remarkable. A chain of succession maintained across 20 centuries, through every upheaval and every disaster, through the fall of empires and the rise of new worlds, an institution that has outlasted almost every other human institution on earth that was already ancient when the great powers of the modern world were born. That has continued, in one form or another, through all the vast changes of 2,000 years. Standing on the hill, one stands at the center of one of the longest continuous human institutions that has ever existed, and there is something almost dizzying in the contemplation of it, in the thought of that unbroken chain reaching back across the centuries into the dim beginnings of a world utterly different from our own. Now let us think about the wider meaning of the Vatican in the story of Western civilization, for this small hill has played a role in that story out of all proportion to its size. Across the medieval centuries, when much of the learning of the ancient world had been lost or scattered, the Church was one of the great preservers of knowledge, and the Vatican in particular became, over time, a great repository of manuscripts and learning. A place where the written treasures of the past were gathered and kept and studied. The great library of the Vatican, founded in the age of the Renaissance popes, but drawing upon collections much older, became one of the most important libraries in the world, holding manuscripts of ancient authors that survived nowhere else, preserving the words of the classical past through the long centuries when so much was lost. Scholars came from across Europe and beyond to study its treasures, and the knowledge preserved and transmitted through it helped to shape the intellectual life of the Western world across the centuries. There is a deep irony and a deep truth in this, in the way that the preservation of the pagan classical past was carried out in large part by the institution of the Church, in the way that the words of ancient authors who knew nothing of the faith that would later dominate Europe were preserved by the scribes and scholars of that faith, copied and recopied across the generations, kept safe through the dangerous centuries when so much was destroyed. The monks who copied ancient texts in their scriptoriums, the scholars who gathered manuscripts into the great library, the popes who patronized learning and collected books, all of them played a part in carrying the knowledge of the ancient world forward across the abyss of time, ensuring that the wisdom and the beauty of the classical past would not be entirely lost. And so the Vatican became not only a place of faith, but a place of learning, a great preserver of the intellectual inheritance of humankind, a role it has continued to play across the centuries and continues to play still. Its library and archives holding treasures beyond counting, its scholars laboring still to study and preserve and transmit the knowledge of the past. Let us think as well about the art, and about what it means that this one small hill holds such a concentration of human creative achievement. The works gathered in the Vatican and created for it include some of the supreme achievements of Western art, works that have shaped the whole subsequent history of painting and sculpture and architecture, works studied and imitated and marveled at by artists ever since. The ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the great church and its dome, the rooms painted by Raphael, the sculptures gathered from the ancient world and created in later ages, all of these together constitute one of the great treasuries of human artistic achievement, a concentration of genius in one small place that has few equals anywhere on earth, and this concentration was not accidental. It was the result of centuries of deliberate patronage, of the choice by generation after generation of popes to gather and commission the finest art they could, to make the Vatican a place of overwhelming beauty as well as of faith and power. Why did they do this? The motives were many and mixed, as human motives always are. There was the desire to honor the sacred, to create beauty worthy of the divine, to lift the minds of the faithful toward higher things through the power of art. There was the desire for prestige and glory, the wish to demonstrate the greatness and the wealth and the importance of the church through the magnificence of its buildings and its art. There was simple love of beauty, the genuine appreciation of art for its own sake that many of the popes possessed, the pleasure of gathering and commissioning beautiful things, and there was the understanding deeply held across these centuries that art could serve faith, that beauty could move the heart and lift the soul, that the magnificence of the church's buildings and images could communicate its message more powerfully than any words. Whatever the mixture of motives, the result was the gathering into this one small place of an astonishing concentration of human creative achievement, a treasury that belongs, in a sense, to all of humankind, and that draws visitors from every corner of the earth to marvel at what human hands and minds have made. As we move toward the close of our long journey, let us return one final time to the deepest theme of this place, to the meaning of memory and continuity that runs through everything we have followed tonight. For the Vatican is, above all else, a monument to the endurance of memory across time, to the human capacity to remember and to preserve, to carry forward across the generations the things that matter, refusing to let them be lost. Everything on that hill exists because of memory, because people remembered and preserved and handed down, across 2,000 years, the things they valued, whether it was the location of a grave, or the words of an ancient author, or the beauty of a work of art, or the traditions of a faith. The hill is a great accumulation of preserved memory, layer upon layer, age upon age, all of it held together by the unbroken thread of human remembering. And there is comfort in this, a deep and quiet comfort that is worth carrying into sleep, for it tells us that things need not be lost, that memory can endure, that the labor and the love and the beauty of the past can be carried forward and preserved, that the dead are not entirely gone so long as they are remembered, that the things we value can outlast us if only we take care to hand them on. In a world where so much is impermanent, where empires rise and fall and generations pass away, and so much is lost to time, the Vatican stands as a testament to what can endure, to the power of memory and care and continuity to preserve across the centuries the things that matter most. It is a place that says, in its silent way, that not everything need be lost, that the past can be kept, that memory is stronger than we sometimes think, that the fragile thread of human remembering can hold across 2,000 years and more. Think, as you drift toward rest, of the long chain of people who made this place and kept it, reaching back across the centuries into the dim past. Think of the first Christians who honored a grave on a muddy hill and refused to forget it. Think of the builders who raised the great church, the artists who filled it with beauty, the scholars who gathered the ancient books, the pilgrims who walked across a continent to reach it, the gardeners and the bell ringers and the countless ordinary workers who tended and preserved it day by day across the generations. Think of the unbroken line of memory that connects them all, each generation receiving the hill and its meaning from the one before and passing it on to the one after. An unbroken chain of care and remembrance stretching across 2,000 years, holding the place and its meaning safe through all the storms of history. And think, too, of your own place in the long story of humankind, of the way you, too, are a link in a chain of memory and inheritance stretching back beyond your knowing and forward beyond your seeing. For we are all, each of us, the inheritors of the past, the recipients of everything that those who came before us made and preserved and handed down, from the words we speak to the knowledge we possess to the very world we inhabit, all of it a gift from the countless generations who lived and labored and died before us. And we too will pass on what we have received, adding our own small contribution to the great accumulation of human memory and achievement, becoming in our turn the foundation for those who come after. There is a great peace in understanding this, in feeling oneself held within the long continuity of human life, neither alone nor lost, but part of something vast and enduring, a single note in a song that has been sung for a very long time and will go on being sung long after we are gone. The night is deep now, and the hill rests quiet beneath the stars. The great church stands silent in the darkness, its dome floating pale against the sky. The lamps burn low over the ancient grave, small steady flames in the vast dark space, keeping their long vigil as they have for so many centuries. Deep below, the buried streets of the dead rest in their 1600 years of silence, the painted walls invisible in the dark, the carved names unread, waiting patiently through the night. In the galleries, the great works of art stand quiet in the shadows, the gathered beauty of the ages resting in the dark. In the gardens, the old trees stir gently in the night wind, and the fountains murmur their ancient song, and the birds sleep among the branches, as they have on so many nights across the centuries. The obelisk stands in the empty piazza, the ancient Egyptian stone that has watched over this ground through 2,000 years of nights, pointing silently at the stars as it always has, older than everything around it, patient and enduring, keeping its long silent watch. And below the hill, at its foot, the old river slides past in the darkness, muddy and eternal, carrying the reflection of the moon down toward the distant sea, as it has done since long before any of this began, since the days when this was only marsh and reeds and the graves of forgotten people, and as it will do long after, when we and all our works have passed away. As the deepest part of the night settles over us, let us take one last slow walk around this ancient hill, gathering the final threads of its story, and letting our minds drift gently over all that we have seen. For there remain a few quiet things worth turning over in the mind, before we let the story rest entirely. A few final reflections to carry with us into sleep. We have traveled a very long way tonight, from the muddy riverbank of the ancient world to the marble city of the present. And we have followed the story across 2,000 years, but a place so old and so full of meaning always holds more. And there is no harm in lingering a little longer in its quiet company. Let us think for a moment about the strangeness of what the Vatican has become, about the curious fact that the smallest independent state in the world should also be one of the most visited and most famous places on earth. There is a paradox at the heart of this that is worth savoring. The Vatican is tiny, so small that a person can walk from one end to the other in a matter of minutes, a mere patch of ground enclosed within the walls of a much larger city. And yet this tiny place draws millions of visitors every year, is known by name to nearly everyone on earth, holds a concentration of art and history and meaning that few places many times its size can match, and stands at the center of a faith followed by a great portion of humankind. The smallness and the greatness sit together in a way that is almost startling, and there is something instructive in it, a reminder that importance is not a matter of size, that a small place can hold vast meaning, that the significance of a place lies not in its dimensions, but in what has happened there and what it has come to mean to people. This paradox of smallness and greatness runs, in fact, through the whole story of the hill from its very beginning. For the Vatican began with the smallest of things, a single humble grave in an ordinary cemetery, the burial place of a fisherman who had lived and died in obscurity, whose grave was no different, at first, from the countless other graves around it, and from that single small grave across 2,000 years grew everything we have followed tonight: the great church and the tiny state, the gathered art and the millions of pilgrims, the whole vast accumulation of history and meaning. The greatness grew from the smallness, the vast from the humble, the enduring from the ordinary, and there is a deep truth in this, a truth that reaches beyond this particular place, about how the greatest things so often grow from the smallest beginnings, about how a single grave, a single memory, a single act of remembrance can, across the long centuries, grow into something that touches the whole world. Let us think, too, about the way this place has weathered the storms of history, about its endurance across 2,000 years of upheaval and change. The hill has seen the fall of the Roman Empire, the collapse of the ancient world, the long dark centuries of the early medieval age. It has seen invasions and sackings, raiders from the sea and armies at the gates. It has seen plagues and famines, the great dyings that swept across Europe in the medieval and early modern centuries. It has seen the church itself torn by division, the great schism when rival popes claimed the office, the Reformation that shattered the unity of Western Christianity. It has seen the loss of the papal lands and the shrinking of a great power to a single hill. It has seen the wars of the modern age, the vast conflicts that convulsed Europe and the world in the 20th century, the armies that marched and the cities that burned, and through all of it, the hill endured, the church stood, the memory was kept, the thread held. There is a great lesson in this endurance, in the way this place has survived storm after storm across 2,000 years, a testament to the resilience of human institutions and human memory, to the capacity of things to endure through even the darkest and most dangerous times. It has not always endured unscathed. There were times of great danger, times when the hill and its treasures were threatened, times when the church was brought low and its future seemed uncertain. There was the sacking of Rome in the 16th century, a terrible episode when the city was overrun by soldiers and much was destroyed, when even the Vatican was not entirely safe, when the Pope of that time had to take refuge in the fortress that guarded the approach to the hill. That fortress, a great round castle beside the river, connected to the Vatican by a raised passageway along the top of a wall, had been built long before as a refuge for the popes in times of danger, and it served that purpose more than once across the centuries, a place where the pope could flee when the hill itself was threatened. The very existence of that fortress and that escape passage is a reminder that the Vatican was not always the peaceful and secure place it seems today, that there were times of real danger, times when those who lived on the hill had to fear for their safety and their lives, times when the great church and its treasures might have been lost. But they were not lost. The hill survived again and again through every danger, and the survival itself is part of the meaning of the place, part of what it has to teach, for the Vatican is, among other things, a great survivor, a place that has endured when so much else has passed away, that has held on to its meaning and its treasures across 2,000 years of a world constantly changing and constantly dangerous. And in an age like our own, when so much seems uncertain, when so much of the world feels precarious and impermanent, there is a particular comfort in the contemplation of something that has endured so long, that has weathered so many storms, that stands still upon its hill after all these centuries, a fixed point in the flow of time, a reminder that some things can last, that endurance is possible, that not everything need be swept away. Let us turn now, as our journey draws toward its close, to think about the future of the hill, about what may become of this ancient place in the ages still to come. We cannot know, of course, what the future holds, any more than the Romans who buried their dead on the hill could have known what would grow from their humble cemetery, any more than the medieval pilgrims could have imagined the great church that would rise where the old Basilica stood. The future is hidden from us, as it has always been hidden from everyone who has ever lived, and we cannot say what the coming centuries will bring to this hill, or to the faith and the institutions centered upon it. But we can say, with some confidence, that the hill will endure, that the great church will stand, that the memory will be kept for a long time yet, for the thread that is held for 2,000 years is not easily broken, and the momentum of 2 millennia of care and continuity will carry the place forward, far into the future, whatever changes the coming ages may bring. And we can say, too, that the deeper meaning of the place, the meaning of memory and continuity and endurance that we have found in it tonight, will remain true regardless of what the future brings. For that meaning does not depend upon any particular institution or any particular faith, but upon the universal human realities of memory and mortality and the longing to endure. So long as human beings remember their dead, so long as they preserve the treasures of the past and hand them down across the generations, so long as they build and create and strive to make things that will outlast them. The meaning that the Vatican embodies will remain true and living, whether or not this particular hill continues to hold it, for the Vatican is, in the end, a monument to something universal, to the human refusal to let the past be lost, to the human capacity to remember and preserve and endure, and that something universal will remain, in one form or another, so long as there are human beings upon the earth to feel it. Let us gather now, one final time, the great themes of this long story, and hold them together in the quiet of the night. We have found, on this ancient hill, a monument to memory, to the human capacity to remember across the centuries, and to refuse to let the past be lost. We have found a monument to continuity, to the unbroken thread of human care and remembrance that has held across 2,000 years, connecting the present to the distant past in an unbroken chain. We have found a monument to endurance, to the resilience of human institutions and human memory in the face of the storms of history, to the capacity of things to last through even the darkest times. We have found a monument to the way the great grows from the small, the vast from the humble, the enduring from the ordinary, a single grave becoming, across the centuries, a place that touches the whole world. And we have found, beneath it all, a monument to the deep human realities of mortality and memory, to the way the living build always upon the foundations of the dead, to the way we are all held within the long continuity of human life, each of us a link in a chain reaching back beyond our knowing and forward beyond our seeing. These are the things the hill has to teach, and they are things worth carrying into sleep, for they are things that bring peace, that quiet the restless mind, that remind us of our place in the vast unfolding story of humankind and of the deep continuities that hold us all. In the contemplation of such things, the small anxieties of the day grow small indeed, set against the great span of time and the long endurance of memory, and there is a settling of the spirit that comes from feeling oneself held within something so vast and so enduring. The hill has stood for 2,000 years and will stand for a long time yet. The river has flowed for longer still, and will flow on after. The stars wheel overhead as they have always done. And we are here, for our little while, part of the great story, inheritors of the past and ancestors of the future, held within the long continuity of human life. And there is peace in that, a deep and quiet peace to carry into rest. Let us imagine now one last scene to hold in the mind as we drift toward sleep. Imagine the hill at the very darkest hour of the night, in the deep stillness before the first light of dawn. The city sleeps all around, silent and dark, only a few lights burning here and there in the vast sprawl of Rome. The piazza is empty, the great colonnades standing silent in the dark, the obelisk pointing at the stars. The great church rises pale and enormous against the night sky, its dome a great dark shape floating above the city, and within it, deep in the vast dark space, the small lamps burn over the ancient grave, points of warm light in the darkness, keeping their long vigil. Below, in the buried necropolis, the ancient tombs rest in total darkness, 1,600 years of silence, the forgotten dead sleeping in the earth beneath the sleeping city. In the gardens, the old trees stand still in the windless dark, and the fountains murmur softly, and the night birds are silent now, roosting in the branches. And over it all, the great dome and the ancient hill and the sleeping city and the flowing river, the stars wheel slowly toward the dawn, as they have wheeled over this hill on so many thousands of nights across the long centuries. And in that deep stillness, if you listen with the ear of the imagination, you can almost feel the vast weight of time that this hill holds. The 2,000 years of history layered one upon another beneath the quiet dark, all the countless lives that have touched this place across the centuries, the Romans and the early Christians, the medieval pilgrims and the Renaissance builders, the artists and the scholars, the popes and the workers, the gardeners and the bell ringers, the millions upon millions of ordinary people who have come to this hill across 2,000 years, all of them gone now, all of them at rest, and yet all of them somehow present still, held in the memory of the place, woven into the stones and the earth, part of the long story that the hill remembers even when no living person recalls their names. There is a great tenderness in this, a great gentle sadness, and a great gentle peace, in the thought of all those vanished lives held safe in the memory of the hill, not entirely lost, not entirely gone, kept somehow in the long continuity of the place they touched. The night is very deep now, and it is nearly time to let the story rest. We have followed the hidden history of this small hill from its humblest beginnings to its present greatness, across 2,000 years of change and endurance, and we have found in it, beneath all the grandeur and all the history, the deep and quiet truths of memory and mortality and continuity that make it not just a monument of stone but a monument of the human spirit. We have walked its ancient streets and its buried tombs, its great church and its quiet gardens, and we have heard its bells and seen its lamps and imagined its long procession of pilgrims across the centuries. And now, as the story draws to its close, we can let it settle gently into the quiet of the night. A completed thing, a whole story told, ready to rest. There is nothing more you need to hold on to now. The story is told, the journey is complete, and you can let it all drift away into the soft dark of sleep. The hill will keep its long vigil without your watching. The lamps will burn over the ancient grave without your tending. The river will flow toward the sea without your seeing. The stars will wheel toward the dawn without your waking. All is well, all is at rest. All is held safe in the long continuity of time and memory. You can let go now and let yourself drift, carried gently toward sleep by the quiet knowledge that the old hill rests peacefully beneath the stars, as it has rested on so many thousands of nights and will rest on so many thousands more, patient and enduring and at peace. Let the great church rest in the darkness, its dome floating pale against the night. Let the ancient tombs rest in their long silence beneath the floors. Let the gathered treasures rest in the quiet galleries. Let the old trees rest in the windless gardens, and the fountains murmur their ancient song, and the night birds sleep among the branches. Let the ancient obelisk keep its silent watch in the empty piazza, as it has for 2,000 years, and let the old river slide gently past at the foot of the hill, carrying the moonlight down toward the sea, patient and eternal, the oldest thread of all in this long story of stone and memory and time. And let yourself rest too now, held within the same great peace, part of the same long story, a single quiet life among the countless lives the hill has known, at rest beneath the same wheeling stars. The night is deep and gentle, and there is nothing more to do, nowhere more to go, nothing more to hold. The story is told, and it is good, and it is time now to let it go, and to let yourself drift down softly and slowly into the quiet dark of sleep, while the old hill keeps its long and patient watch beneath the stars, and the river flows on toward the sea, and the great dome floats silent and pale against the sky, and all the long history of that ancient place settles gently into the stillness of the night, and rests. Sleep now. The hill is at peace, and so may you be. The lamps are burning low, the bells are silent, the river flows on, and the stars keep watch over the old and quiet place, where 2,000 years of memory rest safely in the dark. And in the morning, when the light returns and the world wakes again, the hill will still be there, as it has always been, patient and enduring, keeping its long vigil, holding its ancient memory, waiting quietly through all the ages for whoever will come next to walk its streets, and hear its story and remember, for a little while, the long and gentle history of the hill above the river, where a single grave became, across the centuries, a place that the whole world remembers. Rest now and sleep, and let the quiet of the old hill carry you gently down into the peaceful dark.